So, the Atlantic Council published an interesting article on the Russian Navy and the implications of what has happened recently with their presence in Crimea. And if you hadn't heard, the Russian Navy pulled out its last patrol ship from Crimea. There has been a Russian naval presence in Crimea since 2014. Now, the Ukrainian Navy spokesperson Dmytro Pledenchuk announced the event by saying, quote, "Remember this day." Ukraine has used a mix of domestically produced drones and missiles along with Western-supplied long-range weapons to inflict substantial damage on the Russian fleet. British and French cruise missiles have been crucial, but Ukraine's innovative maritime drones have proven to be the most effective weapons here. The results are pretty evident. At the start of the invasion, the Russian Black Sea Fleet comprised 74 warships primarily stationed in Crimea. Over 2 years, Ukraine has managed to sink or damage around 1/3 of these ships. By mid-2023, reports surfaced of Russian warships being hastily relocated to Novorossiysk for safety. By March of 2024, the British Ministry of Defense declared the Russian Black Sea Fleet is functionally inactive. Ukraine's successes in the Black Sea has had some practical implications for the broader war. It has disrupted Russian logistics, hindered their resupply efforts for troops in southern Ukraine, and limited Russia's ability to launch cruise missile attacks from its warships. Crucially, it has enabled Ukraine to break the blockade of its Black Sea ports and resume commercial shipping via a new maritime corridor. Consequently, Ukrainian agricultural exports are nearing pre-war levels, which is giving Kyiv a vital economic lifeline. It also means it is virtually impossible for Russia to take any coastal cities, including the vital trade artery that is Odessa. Russia's response to Ukraine driving them away from Crimea is quite telling and can offer us some valuable lessons on what the future of this war could look like if we were to allow Ukraine to conduct strikes further and deeper into Russia. It is often suggested that a cornered Vladimir Putin might resort to extreme measures, including nuclear weapons. Well, in reality, he has quietly ordered his remaining warships to retreat following the Black Sea Fleet's defeat. This response is notable because Crimea is symbolic to Putin and the Russians. The Russian invasion of Ukraine began in 2014 with Crimea's seizure, which holds an almost mystical status in Russian folklore as the Black Sea Fleet's home. Over the past decade, Crimea has been featured prominently in Kremlin propaganda. In Putin campaign ads, it symbolized Russia's return to great power status, and Putin has repeatedly touted a personal claim to the historical significance and how it has solidified his legacy. Initially, Crimea's elevated and mystical status has made some of Ukraine's international partners wary of allowing Ukraine to strike the occupied peninsula. However, Ukrainians had no such reservations, creating their own weapons and doing it anyways. They've ignored Kremlin warnings of dire consequences and began targeting Russian military assets across Crimea and the Black Sea. More than 2 years later, these attacks are routine, with the Kremlin media downplaying or just flat out ignoring the frequent sinking and damaging of Russian warships, mainly to spare Putin the embarrassment. The Russian Navy's readiness to retreat from its supposedly sacred ports in Crimea undermines Moscow's so-called red lines and exposes the emptiness of Putin's nuclear threats. Nevertheless, Kyiv's international allies, including the United States, frustratingly remain reluctant to draw the obvious conclusions here. Instead of limiting what Ukraine can do, we should probably allow them to strike further. Western support for Ukraine continues to be defined by this self-defeating fear of Russian escalation. For nearly 2.5 years, Ukraine's partners have been intimidated into denying certain categories of weapons and restricting attacks inside Russia, citing the need to prevent the conflict from spreading further. Western policymakers prefer to ignore the overwhelming evidence from the Black Sea conflict, which shows that when confronted by resolute opposition, Putin is more likely to back down than to escalate. We've seen this time and time again. We've crossed, 24 red lines here with no real backlash coming out of the Kremlin. The West's fear of escalation is Putin's most effective weapon. He continues to limit what we do based on fears that never come to fruition. It limits military aid to Kyiv and prevents Ukraine from striking back against Russia, and it sets the stage for a potential Russian victory at worst, or at best, a prolonged war of attrition that lasts a decade. Western leaders claim that they're trying to avoid a wider war, but continuing to follow this escalation management policy could ultimately lead to the very outcome they seek to prevent. Putin thinks that he is strong because he can manipulate the West and NATO with these threats. If he can continue to do that and see success in it, what stops him from moving on to other nations, including the Baltics?